There should have been nothing on this road, just a black ribbon soaked in the storm. The veteran just wanted to get home, but his dog, Ghost, had other plans. It barked frantically, forcing him to pull over. He got out, annoyed and soaked, just to prove to it that nothing was there. But then, in the headlights, he saw it. A tiny figure huddled on an old wooden bench. A little boy, clutching his chest, sobbing in the pouring rain. The horror wasn't just finding an abandoned child. It was the reason he was there, and his faint whisper about the bad water, a warning that would soon uncover a deadly secret buried by the entire town. Please support us by subscribing to the channel, and let us know, where are you listening to this story from? The rain fell in relentless slanting sheets, turning the winding roads of Pine Creek into slick black ribbons. For Jack Riley, this was the sound of late autumn in Oregon, a percussive drumming on the roof of his old pickup truck that usually soothed the restless corners of his mind. He was a man in his 40s, a former Marine whose quiet strength was etched into the lean lines of his face and the subtle gray streaking his short brown hair at the temples. His kind eyes had seen too much of the world's chaos, and now he sought solitude in the shadow of the great forests, a place where the silence was broken only by the wind and the soft padding of his only true companion. Beside him on the worn bench seat sat Ghost, a 5-year-old German shepherd whose magnificent coat was a rare mixture of ash gray and snow white. Ghost was more than a dog, he was an anchor. His temperament was usually as calm and steady as the deep woods they called home, his intelligence shining in watchful amber eyes that rarely missed a thing. He lay with his head on Jack's lap, a familiar, comforting weight against the rumble of the engine and the rhythmic scrape of the windshield wipers. They were almost home. Jack's small cabin was just a few more miles down the road, a sanctuary of warm wood and firelight against the encroaching cold. But then Ghost stirred. He lifted his head, a low whine vibrating in his chest. His ears, which had been relaxed, were now erect and swiveling, locked onto something outside in the deluge. Jack placed a hand on his back. "Easy, boy. It's just the storm." But Ghost's agitation grew. He stood up on the seat, his powerful frame tense as he pressed his wet nose to the passenger window. A sharp, insistent bark echoed in the small cab, a sound so urgent and out of character that Jack's own senses went on high alert. Ghost pawed at the glass, his claws making a frantic scratching sound, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Trusting the dog's instinct over his own desire for warmth and comfort, Jack slowed the truck and pulled over onto the muddy shoulder of the deserted road. He cut the engine, leaving only the sound of the rain hammering down. Okay, I hear you," Jack said, opening his door. The cold, wet air hit him instantly. He followed Ghost's intense gaze, his own eyes squinting through the downpour. The truck's headlights cut a hazy tunnel through the storm, and in that cone of light, he saw it. A single, dilapidated wooden bench, its paint peeling, sat forlornly by the roadside, and on it, huddled into a small, shivering ball, was a child. Jack's heart seized. He moved quickly, his boots sinking into the soft earth. It was a little boy, no older than 7, soaked to the bone, his thin shirt clinging to his small frame. His face was pale and contorted in pain as he clutched his chest with both arms, his body racked with violent sobs that were nearly swallowed by the roar of the rain. Jack burst through the door of the Pine Creek Community Clinic, the small boy cradled in his arms and wrapped in his own thick jacket. The warm, sterile air of the clinic was a stark contrast to the wild storm outside. A woman looked up from behind the reception desk, her calm expression shifting to one of focused concern. This was Dr. Anya Sharma, the town's sole physician. She was a petite woman in her late 30s, with intelligent, dark eyes and black hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her presence was both professional and deeply reassuring. She immediately led them to an examination room. "Put him on the table," she said, her voice even and calm as she began washing her hands. What happened? Jack quickly recounted the story of the rain, the barking, and the lonely bench, while Ghost settled quietly in a corner, a silent, watchful guardian. Dr. Sharma worked efficiently, gently removing the boy's soaked clothes. He was shivering, his breathing shallow and ragged. "It sounds like pneumonia, from the cold and the wet," she murmured, listening to his chest with her stethoscope. The boy, barely whispering, told them his name was Leo. But as Dr. Sharma continued her examination, her brow furrowed with deeper concern. "There's more here," she said quietly to Jack. "He has a faint rash across his back, and he's severely underweight. This isn't just from one night in the rain. This is chronic." As she spoke, Ghost rose from his corner. He padded silently over to the small pile of Leo's discarded clothing on the floor. His head lowered, and he began to sniff intently at the boy's small, mud-caked rubber boots. It wasn't a casual sniff, it was a focused investigation, his nostrils flaring. A faint, acrid smell, like a bitter chemical, seemed to cling to the rubber. "Ghost," Jack said softly, his attention drawn by the dog's unusual behavior. Dr. Sharma noticed it too. She leaned closer to the boots. "What is that smell?" she wondered aloud. The first piece of a puzzle they didn't yet understand had just been laid on the table, not by a person, but by the instincts of a loyal dog. After finding a contact number on a slip of paper in Leo's pocket, Dr. Sharma made a call. Less than 20 minutes later, the clinic door swung open again. A man stood there, dripping rainwater onto the clean floor. He was tall and wiry, with a sallow complexion and weary, resentful eyes. This was Gary, Leo's father. His rough, calloused hands and the sullen set of his jaw spoke of a hard, joyless life. He stalked into the room. "What is it now?" he grumbled, not even glancing at his son on the table. "He's just looking for attention." Dr. Sharma began to explain her findings, but Gary cut her off. "He's fine. We're going home." He made a move to pull Leo from the table, his movements rough and impatient. The coldness in his demeanor, his complete dismissal of his son's obvious pain, hung in the air, raising more questions than it answered and solidifying a knot of dread in Jack's stomach. A few days passed under a heavy gray sky. The relentless storm had moved on, leaving the Oregon forests shrouded in a damp, chilling mist. Leo was stable at the clinic, under the watchful care of Dr. Sharma. But the image of the small, shivering boy on that bench was seared into Jack's mind. The memory, along with the father's cold dismissal, had settled deep within him, a disquiet that gnawed at the edges of his hard-won peace. He knew he couldn't let it go. He needed to understand where that boy had come from. He drove his truck back to the desolate spot on the winding road, Ghost sitting silent and alert beside him. The decaying bench stood as a lonely monument to the boy's suffering. Jack got out, intending to search the muddy shoulder for footprints, for any sign of a path. But Ghost had no interest in the road. The moment his paws hit the damp earth, his entire demeanor changed. His nose went to the ground, his body tensed with purpose, and he completely ignored Jack's initial direction. He turned and pushed his way through a thick wall of wet ferns that concealed a faint, barely visible trail leading away from the road and into the deep woods. Jack followed without a word. He had learned long ago to trust the dog's instincts above all else. They moved deeper into the dripping forest, the silence broken only by the squelch of Jack's boots and the snap of twigs underfoot. After a 10-minute walk, a foul odor began to permeate the air. It was the same bitter, chemical smell from Leo's boots, but 100 times stronger, thick enough to taste. It grew more potent with every step, making Jack's eyes water. Ghost pressed forward, finally leading him into a small, unnerving clearing. In the center was a small creek, but it was not the pristine mountain stream it should have been. The water was a murky, sluggish brown, with a rainbow-colored oily film swirling on its surface. The rocks along its banks were stained with a slimy, rust-colored residue. The entire place felt profoundly wrong, sick and devoid of life. Ghost didn't hesitate. He trotted directly to a damp mound of fallen leaves near the water's edge and began to dig with a frantic energy, his powerful front paws sending clumps of dark, wet earth flying. Jack moved closer, his heart pounding with a sense of grim discovery. Protruding from the dirt Ghost had unearthed was a flash of bright color. Kneeling down, Jack carefully pulled it free. It was a child's rubber glove, small and bright yellow, but torn at the wrist. He turned it over. The inside was coated with a thick, greasy slime that radiated the sickening chemical smell. This was it. This was the source. This was what Leo had been touching. A cold wave of anger and sorrow washed over Jack as he stared at the small, contaminated glove, the undeniable proof of the poison that had seeped into a child's life. Jack returned to the clinic with the contaminated glove sealed carefully in a plastic bag. He placed it on Dr. Sharma's desk without a word. She stared at it, her usual professional composure cracking to reveal a simmering, cold anger. The small, yellow piece of rubber was no longer just a clue, it was an accusation. It was the piece of tangible evidence she needed to dig deeper, to go beyond a single patient and look at the health of the town itself. While Jack waited with Ghost, Dr. Sharma disappeared into the clinic's small records room. For over an hour, the only sounds were the rustle of paper and the quiet scrape of a filing cabinet drawer. She emerged with a stack of old manila folders, her face grim. "I found it," she said, her voice low and tense. "It's a pattern. For the last 3 years, there has been a significant cluster of illnesses, all from families with ties to the Pine Ridge lumber mill. Chronic coughs, breathing difficulties, persistent skin conditions, just like Leo's. It's all here, dismissed as seasonal allergies or workplace hazards. No one ever connected them. While she had been searching for a medical pattern, Jack had been searching for a historical one. He spent the afternoon at the town's small library, scrolling through years of the local newspaper on a noisy microfilm reader. Pine Ridge was woven into the fabric of the town's history, celebrated for providing jobs. But buried among the celebratory articles, he found what he was looking for. There were reports of protests from about 1.5 years ago, small gatherings of concerned citizens worried about the mill's waste disposal practices. The articles were brief, and the protests seemed to fizzle out as quickly as they began, with the company always issuing statements that they were in full compliance with environmental laws. Then, one photo stopped him. It was a grainy image of a small group holding handmade signs. At the front was a young woman with fire in her eyes, her mouth open as if in mid-sentence. Jack leaned closer to read the caption. The article quoted her, a passionate plea to protect the town's water for the sake of its children. Her name was Sarah Carter, Leo's mother. A chill ran down Jack's spine. He kept searching. He found one final, tiny article from a few weeks after the protest photo was taken. It mentioned that the lead protester, Sarah Carter, had abruptly left town, with local gossip suggesting she had abandoned her family. The connection was instant and horrifying. Jack drove back to the clinic and shared his discovery with Dr. Sharma. They laid it all out. Sarah Carter speaks out against the mill. The company faces public pressure. And then suddenly, Sarah is gone, her reputation ruined by a convenient rumor. The main voice of opposition was silenced, and the illnesses continued, a quiet scar on the town that had been allowed to fester in the dark. Finding Sarah Carter was not easy, but Jack's past life as a Marine had taught him more than just combat. It had taught him how to be methodical, how to follow a trail, and how to find people who did not want to be found. Using public records and making a few carefully worded phone calls, he pieced together a new life for the woman from the newspaper clipping. The trail led him 3 hours away, to a small, unassuming apartment complex on the outskirts of Portland. With Ghost sitting faithfully in the passenger seat, Jack made the long drive, the weight of his mission settling heavier with every mile. He found the right apartment number and knocked, his heart pounding a steady rhythm of anticipation and doubt. The door opened a moment later. The woman standing there was instantly recognizable as the one from the grainy photograph, yet she was profoundly changed. She was in her early 30s, her fiery red hair pulled back in a simple, tired ponytail. The same determined eyes looked out from her face, but they were now clouded with a deep, persistent weariness and the sharp caution of someone who had learned to expect the worst from the world. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wary. Jack kept his own voice low and gentle. "My name is Jack Riley. I'm here to talk to you about your son, Leo." At the sound of her son's name, the defensive wall in her eyes crumbled, replaced by a wave of raw panic and pain. "Is he okay?" she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "He's safe," Jack said quickly. "He's been sick, but he's safe at the clinic in Pine Creek." They sat on the small concrete steps of her apartment building, the city noise a distant hum. As Jack explained everything he and Dr. Sharma had discovered, Sarah's story spilled out of her in a torrent of tears and long-suppressed grief. She confirmed everything. The management at Pine Ridge had called her into a meeting. They told her that if she didn't stop her protests and leave town immediately, they would manufacture evidence against her. They would paint her as an unstable radical, an unfit mother, and they would make sure she lost Leo forever to the foster care system. Terrified and alone, she had believed them. Leaving her son was the most painful thing she had ever done, but she did it because she thought it was the only way to protect him. As she sobbed, her shoulders shaking, Ghost moved from his spot at Jack's feet. He walked over to Sarah and gently, softly, rested his great gray and white head on her knee. He looked up at her, his amber eyes full of a quiet, profound understanding that transcended words. That simple, comforting gesture seemed to break the spell of her despair. She looked from the dog's gentle face to Jack's sincere, steady gaze. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking at a threat or an accuser. She was looking at an ally. A flicker of the old fire returned to her eyes. "I'll come back," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'll fight for him." The fight for justice was swift and decisive. Armed with Sarah's powerful, tearful testimony, Jack's meticulously gathered soil and water samples, and Dr. Sharma's irrefutable medical records, they presented a case to the state authorities that could not be ignored. The story of the sick little boy and the poisoned creek exploded into a statewide scandal. State environmental agencies descended on Pine Creek, and their findings confirmed everything Jack and Ghost had uncovered. The secrets Pine Ridge had buried for years were finally unearthed for all to see. The fallout was immense. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public outrage, the Pine Ridge lumber mill was shut down permanently. The company was hit with crippling fines and was legally mandated to establish a substantial compensation fund for the dozens of families whose health had been silently eroded by its greed. Gary, too, faced the consequences of his actions. For his complicity and neglect, a judge stripped him of his parental rights, his sullen silence in the courtroom a final, pathetic testament to the choices he had made. The community, once scarred by deceit, could finally begin to heal. But the most important victory happened not in a courtroom, but in the quiet waiting area of the clinic. The moment Leo was well enough, Sarah was there. He saw her from across the room, and for a second he stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then he whispered her name, "Mom," and ran into her outstretched arms. As Sarah held him, rocking him gently and crying tears of pure joy, all the fear and pain that had defined his young life finally melted away. He was home. Months later, spring had returned to the forests of Oregon, breathing new life into the woods. The air was warm and smelled of pine and damp earth. Jack, Sarah, and a vibrant, healthy Leo walked along the bank of the once sickly creek, with Ghost trotting happily ahead of them. The water now ran clear and sparkling over the smooth stones. The birds sang in the trees. The forest was alive again. Leo, his cheeks now full and rosy, laughed as he threw a stick for Ghost to chase. He was no longer the frail, haunted child from the bench, but a boy full of life and light. Jack watched them, a profound sense of peace settling over him, a quiet he had not known since long before his days at war. He had come to these woods seeking solitude, a place to hide from the world. Instead, he had found a mission. He had found a purpose. He watched Sarah smile, watched Leo run with his loyal dog, and realized he was no longer just a solitary veteran. In saving this small family, he had inadvertently built one for himself. The silence in his soul was no longer one of emptiness, but of contentment. The story of Jack and Ghost reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the quietest ones, and true healing is found when we find the strength to fight for someone else. If their journey from solitude to belonging touched your heart, we would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments. Every like and share helps these stories of hope find the people who need them most, reminding us that no one is ever truly alone. Please consider subscribing to become part of our community and continue the journey with our next incredible story, which is appearing on your screen right now.